All right, so you know how we've all bitten our tongues at some point, right? Like it's one of those things that just happens.
Oh, yeah.
It hurts and it's embarrassing. But what if I told you that there's actually way more to these little mishaps than just, clumsiness? We got some listener research on this, and it turns out it can be a sign of some pretty interesting things going on in our bodies.
That's right. It's true. Those little moments can actually reveal a lot.
So let's start with the obvious. The research mentions things like, eating too fast, talking while we're chewing, even just physical activity is like the usual suspects. I mean, who hasn't like choked on their own tongue trying to hold a conversation while taking a bite?
Right. And it can even happen to seasoned athletes. Think about it. You're in the middle of a marathon, pushing yourself to the limit,
Yeah.
and suddenly you chomp down on your tongue. Talk about a distraction.
Oh my goodness, I can only imagine.
Yeah.
But here's where things get really interesting. The research also points to stress and focus as like potential factors. So you're telling me my tongue can actually like betray my concentration levels.
It might sound strange, but it actually makes a lot of sense. When we're stressed, our bodies release these hormones that can make our muscles tense up, especially in the jaw. And that constant clenching can make us way more likely to accidentally bite our tongue, especially when we're also trying to eat or talk.
So it's like our tongue is like this little stress barometer sending us a signal to chill out. That's wild.
Exactly. It's a little reminder to pay attention to stress management and find healthy ways to cope.
Hmm. Now this next part is kind of a mystery to me. The research also talks about nighttime tongue biting. So why on earth are we chomping on our tongues while we're asleep? It's not like we're, having these deep philosophical conversations in our dreams, are we?
Well, maybe not, but there are some fascinating possibilities here. One of the most common culprits is something called bruxism, which is just a fancy way of saying teeth grinding.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. Isn't that super annoying for anyone trying to sleep next to you?
Definitely. It's not exactly a quiet habit,
Yeah.
but besides the noise, bruxism can lead to some serious dental problems over time. And you guessed it all, that clenching and grinding can also increase the risk of biting your tongue while you're asleep.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But the research also mentions sleep apnea as a potential factor. And that one seems a bit more surprising to me. Could you explain that connection?
Sure, sleep apnea, which is more common than people realize, causes these disruptions in breathing throughout the night. And these disruptions can actually throw off the normal movements of your jaw while you're asleep, making tongue biting more likely.
So it's not just about how deeply we're sleeping, but also how consistently we're breathing throughout the night.
Precisely. And it shows how seemingly unrelated things in our bodies can be connected in surprising ways. But even beyond bruxism and sleep apnea, there are some more unusual culprits.
Oh, like what?
Well, in some cases, tongue biting can be linked to things like muscle spasms or even Lyme disease.
Lyme disease. Wow, I had no idea it could manifest in something as seemingly minor as tongue biting.
It just goes to show that sometimes even the smallest symptoms can be a sign of something bigger going on.
Okay, so we've covered some of the common and not so common causes of tongue biting. But let's get practical for a minute. Say you actually do bite your tongue. What's the best way to deal with it? The research gives some first aid advice, right?
Absolutely. First and foremost, clean the wound thoroughly with clean hands. It's really important to prevent infection, especially in the mouth where there's already a lot of bacteria.
Yeah, that's a good point. So what about like over-the-counter pain relievers? Are those safe to use for a tongue bite?
Yeah, over-the-counter pain relievers are generally safe for short-term use in these kinds of cases. They can help with the swelling and the pain. And here's an interesting tip from the research. Saltwater rinses can actually help speed up the healing process.
I've heard that before. But why does salt water work so well?
Well, salt water has natural antibacterial properties, so it helps to kill those germs that can cause infection. It also helps to promote blood flow to the area, which aids in healing.
Interesting. The research also mentioned avoiding irritating foods and maintaining good oral hygiene to help things along. I guess that makes sense. Spicy food on an open wound is probably not the best idea.
Right. It's important to remember that even though most tongue bites are minor and heal on their own, there are definitely times when you should seek medical attention.
That's a really good point. What are some red flags that might indicate a more serious situation?
Deep cuts that won't stop bleeding, persistent pain that doesn't get better with home remedies, and any signs of infection like redness, swelling, or pus are all reasons to see a doctor. And believe it or not, sometimes stitches are necessary for tongue bites, especially if the cut is deep or just doesn't seem to be closing up on its own.
Wow, I never would have thought you would need stitches for a tongue bite. It's a good reminder to not underestimate these seemingly minor injuries. But we're just getting started. After a quick break, we'll be back to explore the connections between tongue biting and some even bigger health issues, so stay tuned.
It's true. We often just kind of brush these things off, but they can actually tell us a lot about what's going on with our health overall,
Hmm.
which is kind of what makes this whole deep dive so interesting.
Exactly. So before the break, we were talking about those red flags, like the deep cuts, persistent pain, signs of infection, things that might mean you actually need to see a doctor for a tongue bite. But now I'm really curious to dig into those bigger health connections that you mentioned.
Well, remember how we were talking about stress being a factor in tongue biting? Turns out chronic stress can really have this ripple effect throughout your whole body. It impacts everything from how well you sleep to your digestion, even your immune system.
So someone who's, biting their tongue more often than seems normal, that could be a sign that they need to kind of take a step back and look at their stress levels and find some healthier ways to cope.
Absolutely. It's like your body's trying to tell you something.
Mm.
Like, hey, pay attention. Something's not quite right here.
It really makes you wonder how many other, seemingly random symptoms are actually connected to stress.
Yeah, it's a lot more than we realize.
And speaking of connections, remember how we talked about sleep apnea as a potential cause of nighttime tongue biting? Well, it turns out sleep apnea is linked to a whole bunch of other health issues, too.
Right. Like for starters, people with sleep apnea have an increased risk for things like heart disease, stroke, even type 2 diabetes.
Wow, that's serious stuff. I had no idea the connection was so strong.
It's a really good example of how addressing one health issue, in this case sleep apnea, can have these positive domino effects on other areas of your health.
So anyone who thinks they might have sleep apnea, it's definitely worth talking to their doctor about getting tested and, you know, exploring some treatment options.
Absolutely. Early intervention is key.
Now, earlier you briefly mentioned Lyme disease as a potential, although less common, cause of tongue biting. Could you tell us a little bit more about that connection? It seems so unexpected.
It is pretty surprising. Lyme disease is a bacterial infection that's spread through tick bites, and it can cause all sorts of symptoms, including neurological problems. And in some cases, these neurological issues can actually affect muscle control, which might explain why some people with Lyme disease experience tongue biting.
So it's not like the Lyme disease itself is directly causing the tongue biting, but it's more like the neurological effects that it can have on the body.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that our bodies are incredibly complex, and sometimes these seemingly isolated symptoms can be connected to some underlying condition that needs medical attention.
That's fascinating. It really makes you appreciate how everything in our bodies is connected. But I have to admit, it also makes me a little nervous. Like, should I be overanalyzing every little ache and pain now?
I don't think so. It's all about finding that balance between being aware of what your body's telling you without jumping to conclusions or letting anxiety take over.
So how can we get better at, tuning into those signals without going overboard?
I think it starts with paying attention to patterns. So if you notice a symptom that keeps coming back or just doesn't seem to go away with simple home remedies, it's probably a good idea to mention it to your doctor. They can help figure out if you need to look into it further.
That makes sense. It's about listening to our bodies and knowing when to seek professional guidance. This whole conversation has really highlighted something else for me, too.
Oh, what's that?
The importance of understanding the why behind things. Like, it's not enough to just know that biting your tongue can be caused by stress or sleep apnea. It's about understanding how those conditions actually impact our bodies on a deeper level. That's what really empowers us to make, informed decisions about our health.
I completely agree. Knowledge is power,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it comes to our well-being. And that's exactly what we're trying to do here with this deep dive. Explore these fascinating connections between seemingly simple things like tongue biting and the bigger picture of our health.
Well said.
Yeah.
But I think we've kept our listeners waiting long enough. Let's wrap things up with some final takeaways. And as always, a thought-provoking question to ponder. Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into, accidental tongue bites, I think we can all agree we've learned a lot more than just like basic first aid.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how something so small can lead to a whole conversation about like stress and sleep and even Lyme disease.
Right. It really shows you how everything in our bodies is connected and how these little things can sometimes be a sign of something bigger.
Totally. It's like our bodies are constantly sending us these messages. And it's up to us to pay attention and figure out what they mean.
So for our listener out there who might be thinking, okay, I get it. Tongue biting can be more than just clumsiness. But what do I actually do with this information? What would be your advice?
Well, first of all, don't freak out. Most tongue bites are totally harmless and heal on their own.
Mm-hmm.
just, basic first aid. But if you notice you're biting your tongue a lot, especially if it comes with other things like jaw pain or headaches or trouble sleeping, it's probably worth mentioning to your doctor.
Yeah, that's great advice. It's all about being aware of what your body's telling you and knowing when to, get professional help. But I think this deep dive has also shown us how important it is to be proactive about our health.
Absolutely. We tend to wait until something's wrong before we actually start paying attention. But when we understand the connections between things like stress and tongue biting, we can actually make healthier choices in our everyday lives.
So it's not just about treating the symptoms, but about getting to the root of the problem.
Exactly. It's about seeing the whole picture of our health and realizing that it's all connected.
Well said. Okay, so as always, I like to end our deep dives with a thought-provoking question for our listeners to think about. So here it is. If your tongue could talk, what message would it be sending you right now?
Wow, that's a really good one. Makes you stop and think about what your body's trying to tell you.
Right. Maybe it's telling you to slow down or de-stress or get more sleep. Or maybe it's something totally different. The point is to listen and be open to those messages.
I love that. And, even though those accidental tongue bites can be painful, they might actually be the wake-up call we need to start taking better care of ourselves.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been really eye-opening. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those tongues safe.